it's really hard for a deck like Spikes to beat a bunch of interaction early in the game for threat. The deck is quite prone to run out of threats early, faced with a Grief Ephemerate or something of the sort.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that like both of these decks are really powerful and do this proactive thing, and Eduardo just has an added level of interaction. Like maybe what he's doing is a little bit less powerful, but maybe not that much either. So agree with you on that. All right,
Yeah,
look.
this is a really interesting hand for Eduardo, where Prismatic Ending is hard, plus Goryo's Vengeance is hard to mull, but you need to have some way to actually get cards in the bin.
Yeah, yeah. You need to have like interaction is nice, but you have to do something proactive as well. Yeah, it looks like Eduardo's on 5 and Spike is, I think, kept as 6.
Yeah, I believe that's what happened. And I think early game, particularly for Eduardo, given how we saw Spike's deck play out against yours, it's all about keeping Spike off of amulets early with stuff like Prismatic Ending and Grief. So that opening hand, even if it's a 5, it has Prismatic Ending in it, and I'd be pretty happy in Eduardo's spot.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that hand it looks really great. Like the power of Prismatic Ending against Amulet is like big. And looking at Spike's hand too, it doesn't look like he has that much speed, especially without the Amulet.
Yeah, the more so even than the more general Titan deck. Spike's deck, I think, really struggles when there's not an amulet in play. The ramp backup game plan is a lot weaker when the stuff you're casting is things like Timeless Lotus, and you don't have things like Explores to naturally increase your mana. So very reliant on amulet this deck, and early interaction on it can be quite punishing.
Yeah. And now we're at the point where Eduardo is looking to fire off one of his numerous tainted indulgences and hopefully find some action. Successfully thwarted Spike's early game, but now looking to do something powerful himself.
Yeah, and in Spike's seed, I think at this point it's just about finding another amulet because there's nothing else that really does it here. This saga might be fine, but it'll take quite a while to get going.
And there is the amulet. It's a nice one. So
Yeah,
now if you're Eduardo, I guess are you just looking for another prismatic ending, or are you trying to uh say, okay, like I've stymied the early pressure, let's try to do something powerful.
I think you still very much need a prismatic ending in this spot. The amulet, if it sticks around, that's going to be pretty hard for Eduardo to keep up with. While both decks are doing strong proactive things, Eduardo's strong proactive thing does not win the game on its own.
And it looks like maybe found a prismatic ending off of this archaeologist.
Yeah, that looks like another ending to me, which is pretty tough for Spike because there's still nothing happening with this hand. And now that he's out of 2 amulets, finding one just starts getting pretty difficult.
Yeah, and then notably was a little bit short of being able to copy with the garden as well. So just a really unfortunate sequence for Spike there.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, Eduardo still hasn't put a creature in the graveyard or presented anything like actually powerful. Well, as I say that, there's an Atraxa, but
Yeah, and I think we've reached the point where Eduardo kind of has to put the screws to Spike and try and actually close out this game, like you said. I mean, Spike's backup game plan may not be the strongest, but it still exists. There's 5 mana in play. There's a 7-drop in hand. Like once Cultivated Colossuses and such start getting hard cast, Eduardo gets back into trouble. So it's very much, I think, about closing out the game in the next few turns.
yeah, I agree with that. What do you like here? Do you like playing a Tainted Indulgence, or do you go for the Ephemerate and try to see if you find something off of that?
I really like Tainted Indulgence because what it does is it gives Eduardo the out of finding a grief in addition to the out of finding a reanimator spell. A grief to go with the second Tainted Indulgence, and then you grief ephemerate would also be pretty strong against Spike here. You just need to find something proactive.
Yeah, I feel like another prismatic ending is nice if Spike does find another amulet, but I think we've almost passed the point of amulet in this game now to where um if you were to do something like the Grief Ephemerate and strip the like Archmage's Charm Cultivator Colossus, then Spike would be, on nothing basically. But
Yeah, I think at this point, what Eduardo wants to be doing is just ephemerating that Philology Archaeologist, maybe, and try digging just several cards deep for a Goryo to try and close out this game.
found another Ephemerate, it looks like. So the value is there for Eduardo. He's seeing a lot of cards, accumulating a lot of cards, but has yet to actually, present something powerful.
And one thing I hadn't really recognized was how potent this ephemerate Philology Archaeologist engine is. I hadn't really Archaeologist struck me as like one of the weaker cards in the deck. It had its position, but this ephemerate into Archaeologist and then ephemerate is another rebuy at Archaeologist ETBs means that in a game against a slower deck like this where there's not a lot of pressure, uh, Eduardo can really get into pretty strong spot where finding Goryos is not an if, it's a when question at this point.
Right, and I mean, still hasn't found it, but has gone through like effectively half of his deck at this point. So the speed at which Eduardo's digging through his deck is impressive, but still no grief, no Goryo. So Spike's still live.
Yeah, I
Probably.
believe this is the one turn Spike has to find an amulet.
All right. So with a saga, Spike will get an amulet. Theoretically, get an amulet next turn, but that might be a little too late.
Yeah. I
Depending on how Eduardo is able to proceed.
Yeah, with the ephemerate in hand, and I imagine a Goryo's on an Atraxa, it feels like Spike's in a lot of trouble. It's Atraxa will just look so many cards deep that I imagine there's another grief that gets found, and at that point with ephemerate that just shreds Spike's hand.
Yeah, I mean, Spike's hand is only 2 spells, so Grief Ephemerate puts him in a spot where you have to top deck, which is not really where you want to be. With that being said, there are a lot of powerful draws in Spike's deck, so I wouldn't say, the game is just over at that spot, but you've certainly put yourself in a commanding position.
Well, I think there might be another layer of problem on top of that, even as far as top decking goes, because if there's a planes found, what Eduardo can do is grief and then blink it with touch of the spirit realm, and then ephemerate it in Spike's draw step to really deny him any opportunity to find something that gets him out of this position.
And it looks like a Grief is found here, so that's probably going to. There's also a Goryo's Vengeance as well. So now Eduardo has all the tools. Um, you know, just have to decide how to play it, how to sequence them. Looks like it's going to be the Goryos on the Atraxa. And another Grief and like there's a Prismatic Ending and a Grief and a Faithful Mending as well.
Yeah, no, it doesn't look like there's any. I wonder whether there's even any untapped white lands left in Eduardo's deck. Being able to double blink with either ephemerate or touch the spirit realm seems pretty important here. Either with the grief draw stuff line or to keep the Atraxa around versus the Goryos to make sure you have an actual threat that's applying pressure next turn.
Yeah. And I kind of like, I think you can make that decision after you lead with the grief and see. And it looks like he does have another white source. So yeah, you can lead with the grief, see what you're looking at, and then decide how you want to proceed from there. And I feel like with the tools that Eduardo has, there's probably a line here that leaves Spike pretty close to not having many outs.
Yeah, I think with the second white sauce for Ephemerate or Touch the Spell from, it seems pretty over for Spike here. Particularly since there's yet another Ephemerate in hand. So really, you're Ephemerating a track, so you're taking all Spike's cards forever, and I have a hard time imagining Spike coming back from that.
Yeah, it is very difficult to win a game of Magic where you don't have any cards. So, presuming that Eduardo does end up winning this game, which looks promising, I don't want to call it over quite yet because anything can happen. Do you think that it improves for Spike after sideboard, or is this just how you think this matchup is going to be?
I would have to take a closer look at Spike's sideboard, but based on what I saw against you, I don't think Spike gets that many tools for a matchup like this. Yeah, the Grief Ephemerate plan is just really tough for a deck like Spike's. There's just not very much counterplay in terms of cheap things, and really that's the part of the deck that is scary. Like, sure, the Atraxa plan is all well and good, but if Spike just loses early threat, it's really hard for a deck like this to piece together a win when down 2 or 3 spells.
Yeah, it's a very resource heavy deck that, like we saw Eduardo mold a 5 this game and he was able to, I mean, very easily assemble a lot of value through it. But it's much less easier for Spike to do the same thing because he just has so much less card advantage and more, synergy type advantage.
The way this is panned out, Spike is going to get a draw step.
I mean, that's important. That's step one right there. The first step is at least getting to see one card.
Yeah, there's like functionally 2 amulets in play, so something like an Escape to the Wilds might have Spike off to the races. I
Yeah.
wouldn't call this one over quite yet.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there are still a lot of pretty sick draws that he could like pull out. He'll have access to a lot of mana. An amulet was the draw. So now, I mean, you that was a card he's been wanting all game, but at this point, it's maybe not anymore.
Yeah, I don't think Amulet is quite cutting it here. It doesn't really matter how many copies of Amulet you have if you have no threats.
Yeah,
And I suppose there's not another Ephemerate, so it's quite possible Spike gets another draw step as well.
yeah, and I mean, notably, while Eduardo has such a giant advantage in this game, like the kill pressure is not that high. Um,
Yeah, I'd suspect this ends up being a 2-turn clock regardless, because what Eduardo can do is attack with the Traxa one turn, and then Goryo's back Grizzlebrand and attack the 14 in the air next turn. So this is still gonna be a kill next turn. It's just a matter of finding, I think, one more piece of interaction before that.
and these prismatic endings that have been sitting in Eduardo's hands are now actually live to take out some of these amulets. And at least, even if you can't disrupt a draw from Spike, you can certainly lower the impact of it by stripping 2 of these.
Yeah, I think with the Touch the Spirit Realm, I guess there's probably not a third white land in Eduardo's deck, but if there is, then I could see that getting.
And it looks like that is going to just be the game. All right, so hard to see these sideboards exactly. I don't know if there's anything that stands out to you as being like an important sideboard card for either player.
For Spike, we saw that one Elesh Norn come into play, and I do think that is impossible for Eduardo's deck to beat if it actually enters the battlefield before reanimation happens. But that's a pretty big ask. Um, I don't think there's much for Eduardo that really matters. I think you just want to stick with that Grief Ephemerate game plan. That's still what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, it looked like the game one plan is kind of just the plan that you want for this matchup, and like you had said before, Spike doesn't actually have that many tools to change the matchup around. So, there even though Eduardo doesn't have much of a sideboard for this matchup, or maybe I don't even know if he sideboarded anything. I'm not sure that it's maybe that relevant.
Yeah, it's still very much the same game plan. It's a little awkward on the draw when it's hard to keep Spike's Amulet off the board. On the play, I wouldn't even be surprised if something like Teferi came in for Eduardo to bounce as a Saga. But yeah, on the draw, I think still very much the same game plan as game one.
Yeah, I really like that. Dichotomy between Teferi on the play versus the draw. Like even in my match, it was really powerful in the play in that one game. And I was unsure of how many to leave into my deck, if I should keep them all or especially on the draw, cut some of them. I wonder if Spike wins this game if Eduardo will switch to bringing in some Teferis.
And I
Oh, and
mean,
that
this is kind of ideal for Spike, where there's been no interaction on turn one and an amulet drawn.
yeah, this is looking pretty good.
All it takes is one black card for grief, though.
And we found it. Yeah, I think that's going to buy Eduardo the grief ephemerate here is going to buy Eduardo so much time. It's not going to win the game, but Eduardo's deck is so powerful that just buying this amount of time is going to really like stifle Spike's possible explosive draw.
Yeah, and that Fateful Mending being one of the last few cards in hand is so important too. It just means that Eduardo is going to look at like 6 cards over the next 2 turns, and there's not really room for him to whiff looking at quite that many cards. Another cantrip might have maybe, in Spike Spot, you can hope Eduardo messes you cobble something together. But with Fateful Mending specifically, it's just a lot of looks, and that makes it really hard on Spike.
Oh wow, drew another amulet. That's huge.
Yeah, I wonder what the Spike Ink with the Golos into play this turn. I think he can if he wants to.
Think let's see, he float a mana. Oh, he used that to pay for the
Oh, I,
looks
I
like
guess it depends what he finds off the stirrings.
yeah.
Yeah, I suppose a little awkward that he had to use his land drop beforehand, so there's no option of trying to find Lotus Field or something like that.
I like that Eduardo is fetching to see his top card before he makes a decision here. Like maybe he wants to force a negation this, but seeing the top card lets you inform. I I don't know how you feel about using the force here. I feel like it might be a little too much, but
Yeah, I think I'm very rarely using the force here in Eduardo's spot, but what it lets him do is if he does have some sort of action on top that is going to put away this game pretty neatly on its own, then forcing is pretty safe.
and now crucially Eduardo getting to turn 3 like has the mana to cast the force of negation. So strips Spike of cards that weren't that were creatures and left him with just a spell to be able to force. So it was a nice sequence.
Yeah, I talked about Elesh Norn being really hard for Eduardo to beat if it comes down. It is threatening to come down next turn. There's no counterspell for it, but notably, Grizzlebrand is a reanimation target that doesn't really care about Elesh Norn anyway. So even if that does end up happening, the game's not quite over for Eduardo, and that's a big if at this point.
Right. Yeah, that is assuming that this copy of Grief does not enter the battlefield yet again at some point. But right now, it looks like it might be possible that this Elesh Norn does hit play.
And Arsenal, I think, going to be pretty tough here for Eduardo without actually a reanimation spell. Uh, ga- Game like some decks perhaps will have access to removal for Elesh Norn, so if it comes down, there's lines to play through it. But I'm pretty sure Eduardo's deck actually is incapable of removing Elesh Norn. I think the only removal spell in question is Prismatic Ending, and I don't believe there is a red source in Eduardo's deck, though there are the other four colors. So not quite ending that Elesh Norn, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and this is huge. I mean, this is a huge swing for Spike. I think maybe the only card is Teferi's, but I don't believe Eduardo brought those in. So drawing that Elesh Norn here and Eduardo's interaction just being forced negation, really huge. But there is the Goryos for Gristlebrand.
Yeah, and Goryo's for Gristlebrand probably ends up cutting it because at this point, Spike sure has an Elesh Norn play. The Elesh Norn is not going to 1v1 a Grizzlebrand in combat, assuming it gets blinked. And Spike is, I'm pretty sure, never resolving another actual threat for the rest of the game.
Right. Yeah, I think, yeah, presuming that Eduardo finds a way to keep Gristlebrand in play, which it looks like he did find an Ephemerate. It's just a matter of, you know, time before that Gristlebrand finishes the game off. Even though that Elesh Norn does shut down a lot of the power and interaction. And also it looks like there's a prismatic ending too, which will at least reduce some of the speed of Spike, even if he does manage to get some draws.
Yeah, it's a little tough with Elesh Norn in play because that means even with just one amulet, Spike gets to get so much mana, you get to double up on the untap triggers. But Eduardo still needs actual threats. I suppose the griefs can't be blinked on draw step. So Spike should get one draw to find something like some sort of creature threat. Golos or Emrakul, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think Spike just has to basically spike a huge turn here to have any kind of chance because you're not getting another turn.
Yeah, I believe Golos might get there. There isn't quite enough mana for Emrakul, so I think it needs to be just Golos this turn, given there's a Force of Negation in hand, so any non-creature threat is not getting there.
Yeah, I think Golos and then chaining that into a number of other cards, and fighting through however many Force of Negations and blue cards will be kept by Eduardo is really the line. But it's you have to draw it. You have one turn to draw it. So
Yeah, I think Golos might still be an actual win here, if that's the draw for turn. I believe Spike would get 8 mana and then get to spin with Golos at least once, maybe multiple times.
yeah, it
But
would certainly provide a fighting chance.